Chapter 6 of The Spoils of Poynton. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Spoils of Poynton by Henry James, Chapter 6. It was a great relief to the girl at last to perceive that the dreadful move would really be made. What might happen if it shouldn't had been from the first indefinite. It was absurd to pretend that any violence was probable, a tussle, dishevelment, shrieks. Yet Fleeta had an imagination of a drama, a great scene, a thing somehow of indignity and misery, of wounds inflicted and received, in which indeed, though Mrs. Gareth's presence, with movements and sounds, loomed large to her, Owen remained indistinct and on the whole unaggressive. He wouldn't be there with a cigarette in his teeth, very handsome and insolently quiet. That was only the way he would be in a novel, across whose interesting page some such figure, as she half closed her eyes, seemed to her to walk. Fleeta had rather, and indeed with shame, a confused, pitying vision of Mrs. Gareth, with her great scene left in a manner on her hands, Mrs. Gareth missing her effect, and having to appear merely hot and injured and in the wrong. The symptoms that she would be spared even that spectacle resided not so much, through the chambers of Poynton, in an air of concentration as in the hum of buzzing alternatives. There was no common preparation, but one day, at the turn of a corridor, she found her hostess standing very still, with the hanging hands of an invalid and the active eyes of adventure. These eyes appeared to Fleeta to meet her own with a strange dim bravado, and there was a silence almost awkward before either of the friends spoke. The girl afterwards thought of the moment as one in which her hostess mutely accused her of an accusation, meeting it, however, at the same time by a kind of defiant acceptance. Yet it was with mere melancholy candour that Mrs. Gareth at last sighingly exclaimed, "I'm thinking over what I had better take." Fleeta could have embraced her for this virtual promise of a concession, the announcement that she had finally accepted the problem of knocking together a shelter with the small salvage of the wreck. It was true that when after their return from Rix they tried to lighten the ship, the great embarrassment was still immutably there. The odiousness of sacrificing the exquisite things one wouldn't take to the exquisite things one would. This immediately made the things one wouldn't take the very things one ought to, and, as Mrs. Gareth said, condemned one, in the whole business, to an eternal vicious circle. In such a circle for days she had been tormentedly moving, prowling up and down, comparing incomparables. It was for that one had to cling to them and their faces of supplication. Fleeta herself could judge of these faces, so conscious of their race and their danger, and she had little enough to say when her companion asked her if the whole place, perversely fair on October afternoons, looked like a place to give up. It looked, to begin with, through some effect of season and light, larger than ever, immense, and it was filled with the hush of sorrow, which in turn was all charged with memories. Everything was in the air, every history of every find, every circumstance of every struggle. Mrs. Gareth had drawn back every curtain and removed every cover. She prolonged the vistas, opened wide the whole house, gave it an appearance of awaiting a royal visit. The shimmer of wrought substances spent itself in the brightness. The old golds and brasses, old ivories and bronzes, the fresh old tapestries and deep old damasks, threw out a radiance in which the poor woman saw in solution all her old loves and patiences, all her old tricks and triumphs. Fleeta had a depressed sense of not, after all, helping her much. This was lightened indeed by the fact that Mrs. Gareth, letting her off easily, didn't now seem to expect it. Her sympathy, her interest, her feeling for everything for which Mrs. Gareth felt, were a force that really worked to prolong the deadlock. "I only wish I bored you and my possessions bored you," that lady with some humour declared. Then you'd make short work with me, bundle me off, tell me just to pile certain things into a cart and have done. Fleeta's sharpest difficulty was in having to act up to the character of thinking Owen a brute, or at least to carry off the inconsistency of seeing him when he came down. By good fortune it was her duty, her function, as well as a protection to Mrs. Gareth. She thought of him perpetually, and her eyes had come to rejoice in his manly magnificence more even than they rejoiced in the royal cabinets of the Red Saloon. She wondered, very faintly at first, why he came so often. But of course she knew nothing about the business he had in hand, over which, with men red-faced and leather-legged, he was sometimes closeted for an hour in a room of his own that was the one monstrosity of Poynton, all tobacco pots and bootjacks, his mother had said, such an array of arms of aggression and castigation that he himself had confessed to 18 rifles and 40 whips. He was arranging for settlements on his wife. He was doing things that would meet the views of the Brigstocks. Considering the house was his own, Fleeta thought it nice of him to keep himself in the background while his mother remained, making his visits, at some cost of ingenuity about trains from town, only between meals, doing everything to let it press lightly upon her that he was there. This was rather a stoppage to her meeting Mrs. Gareth on the ground of his being a brute. The most she really at last could do was not to contradict her when she repeated that he was watching, just insultingly watching. He was watching, no doubt, but he watched somehow with his head turned away. He knew that Fleeta knew at present what he wanted of her, so that it would be gross of him to say it over and over. It existed as a confidence between them, and made him sometimes, with his wandering stare, meet her eyes as if a silence so pleasant could only unite them the more. He had no great flow of speech, certainly, and at first the girl took for granted that this was all there was to be said about the matter. Little by little she speculated as to whether, with a person who, like herself, could put him, after all, at a sort of domestic ease, it was not supposable that he would have more conversation if he were not keeping some of it back for Mona. From the moment she suspected he might be thinking what Mona would say to his chattering so to an underhand companion, an inmate all but paid, this young lady's repressed emotion began to require still more repression. She grew impatient of her situation at Poynton. She privately pronounced it false and horrid. She said to herself that she had let Owen know that she had, to the best of her power, directed his mother in the general sense he desired, that he quite understood it, and that he also understood how unworthy it was of either of them to stand over the good lady with a notebook and a lash. Wasn't this practical unanimity just practical success? Fleeta became aware of a sudden desire, as well as of pressing reasons, to bring her stay to Poynton to a close. She had not, on the one hand, like a minion of the law, undertaken to see Mrs. Gareth down to the train and locked, in sign of her abdication, into a compartment. Neither had she, on the other, committed herself to hold Owen indefinitely in dalliance while his mother gained time or dug a countermine. Besides, people were saying that she fastened like a leech on other people who had houses where something was to be picked up. This revelation was frankly made her by her sister, now distinctly doomed to the curate, and in view of whose nuptials she had almost finished, as a present, a wonderful piece of embroidery, suggested at Poynton by an old Spanish altar cloth. She would have to exert herself still further for the intended recipient of this offering, turn her out for her marriage with more than that drapery. She would go up to town, in short, to dress Maggie, and their father, in lodgings at West Kensington, would stretch a point and take them in. He, to do him justice, never reproached her with profitable devotions. So far as they existed he consciously profited by them. Mrs. Gareth gave her up as heroically as if she had been a great bargain, and Fleeta knew that she wouldn't at present miss any of Owen's, for Owen was shooting at Waterbath. Owen shooting was Owen lost, and there was scant sport at Poynton. The first news she had from Mrs. Gareth was news of that lady's having accomplished, in form at least, her migration. The letter was dated from Rix, to which place she had been transported by an impulse apparently as sudden as the inspiration she had obeyed before. "Yes, I've literally come," she wrote, "with a bandbox and a kitchen maid. I've crossed the Rubicon. I've taken possession. It has been like plumping into cold water. I saw the only thing was to do it, not to stand shivering. I shall have warmed the place a little by simply being here for a week. When I come back the ice will have been broken. I didn't write to you to meet me on my way through town, because I know how busy you are, and because, besides, I'm too savage and odious to be fit company even for you. You'd say I really go too far, and there's no doubt whatever I do. I'm here, at any rate, just to look round once more, to see that certain things are done before I enter in force. I shall probably be at Poynton all next week. There's more room than I quite measured the other day, and a rather good set of old Worcester. But what are space and time? What's even old Worcester to your wretched and affectionate A.G.?" The day after Fleeta received this letter she had occasion to go into a big shop in Oxford Street, a journey that she achieved circuitously, first on foot and then by the aid of 2 omnibuses. The second of these vehicles put her down on the side of the street opposite her shop, and while on the curbstone she humbly waited, with a parcel, an umbrella, and a tucked-up frock, to cross in security, she became aware that close beside her a hansom had pulled up short, in obedience to the brandished stick of a demonstrative occupant. This occupant was Owen Gareth, who had caught sight of her as he rattled along, and who, with an exhibition of white teeth that, from under the hood of the cab, had almost flashed through the fog, now alighted to ask her if he couldn't give her a lift. On finding that her destination was just over the way, he dismissed his vehicle and joined her, not only piloting her to the shop, but taking her in, with the assurance that his errands didn't matter, and that it amused him to be concerned with hers. She told him she had come to buy a trimming for her sister's frock, and he expressed a hilarious interest in the purchase. His hilarity was almost always out of proportion to the case, but it struck her at present as more so than ever, especially when she had suggested that he might find it a good time to buy a garnishment of some sort for Mona. After wondering an instant whether he gave the full satiric meaning, such as it was, to this remark, Fleeta dismissed the possibility as inconceivable. He stammered out that it was for her he would like to buy something ripping, and that she must give him the pleasure of telling him what would best please her. He couldn't have a better opportunity for making her a present, the present, in recognition of all she had done for Mummy, that he had had in his head for weeks. Fleeta had more than one small errand in the big bazaar, and he went up and down with her, pointedly patient, pretending to be interested in questions of tape and of change. She had now not the least hesitation in wondering what Mona would think of such proceedings. But they were not her doing, they were Owen's, and Owen, inconsequent and even extravagant, was unlike anything she had ever seen him before. He broke off, he came back, he repeated questions without heeding answers. He made vague, abrupt remarks about the resemblances of shop-girls and the uses of chiffon. He unduly prolonged their business together, giving Fleeta a sense that he was putting off something particular that he had to face. If she had ever dreamed of Owen Gareth as nervous, she would have seen him with some such manner as this. But why should he be nervous? Even at the height of the crisis his mother hadn't made him so, and at present he was satisfied about his mother. The one idea he stuck to was that Fleeta should mention something she would let him give her. There was everything in the world in the wonderful place, and he made her incongruous offers: a travelling rug, a massive clock, a table for breakfast and bed, and above all, in a resplendent binding, a set of somebody's works. His notion was a testimonial, a tribute, and the "works" would be a graceful intimation that it was her cleverness he wished above all to commemorate. He was immensely in earnest, but the articles he pressed upon her betrayed a delicacy that went to her heart. What he would really have liked, as he saw them tumbled about, was one of the splendid stuffs for a gown, a choice proscribed by his fear of seeming to patronize her, to refer to her small means and her deficiencies. Fleeta found it easy to chaff him about his exaggeration of her deserts. She gave him the just measure of them in consenting to accept a small pin-cushion, costing sixpence, in which the letter F was marked out with pins. A sense of loyalty to Mona was not needed to enforce this discretion, and after that first allusion to her she never sounded her name. She noticed on this occasion more things in Owen Gareth than she had ever noticed before, but what she noticed most was that he said no word of his intended. She asked herself what he had done, in so long a parenthesis, with his loyalty, or at least with his form, and then reflected that even if he had done something very good with them, the situation in which such a question could come up was already a little strange. Of course he wasn't doing anything so vulgar as to make love to her, but there was a kind of punctilio for a man who was engaged. That punctilio didn't prevent Owen from remaining with her after they had left the shop, from hoping she had a lot more to do, and from pressing her to look with him for a possible glimpse of something she might really let him give her, into the windows of other establishments. There was a moment when, under this pressure, she made up her mind that his tribute would be, if analysed, a tribute to her insignificance. But all the same he wanted her to come somewhere and have luncheon with him. What was that a tribute to? She must have counted very little if she didn't count too much for a romp in a restaurant. She had to get home with her trimming, and the most in his company she was amenable to was a retracing of her steps to the Marble Arch, and then, after a discussion when they had reached it, a walk with him across the park. She knew Mona would have considered that she ought to take the omnibus again, but she had now to think for Owen as well as for herself. She couldn't think for Mona. Even in the park the autumn air was thick, and as they moved westward over the grass, which was what Owen preferred, the cool greyness made their words soft, made them at last rare, and everything else dim. He wanted to stay with her. He wanted not to leave her. He had dropped into complete silence, but that was what his silence said. What was it he had postponed? What was it he wanted still to postpone? She grew a little scared as they strolled together, and she thought. It was too confused to be believed, but it was as if somehow he felt differently. Fleeta Vetch didn't suspect him at first of feeling differently to her, but only of feeling differently to Mona. Yet she was not unconscious that this latter difference would have had something to do with his being on the grass beside her. She had read in novels about gentlemen who on the eve of marriage, winding up the past, had surrendered themselves for the occasion to the influence of a former tie, and there was something in Owen's behaviour now, something in his very face, that suggested a resemblance to one of those gentlemen. But whom and what, in that case, would Fleeta herself resemble? She wasn't a former tie. She wasn't any tie at all. She was only a deep little person for whom happiness was a kind of a pearl-diving plunge. It was down at the very bottom of all that had lately occurred. For all that had lately occurred was that Owen Gareth had come and gone at Poynton. That was the small sum of her experience, and what it had made for her was her own affair, quite consistent with her not having dreamed it had made a tie, at least what she called one, for Owen. The old one, at any rate, was Mona, Mona whom he had known so very much longer. They walked far, to the southwest corner of the great gardens, where, by the old round pond and the old red palace, when she had put out her hand to him in farewell, declaring that from the gate she must positively take a conveyance, it seemed suddenly to rise between them that this was a real separation. She was on his mother's side, she belonged to his mother's life, and his mother in the future would never come to Poynton. After what had passed she wouldn't even be at his wedding, and it was not possible now that Mr. Garratt should mention that ceremony to the girl, much less express a wish that the girl should be present at it. Mona, from decorum, and with reference less to the bridegroom than to the bridegroom's mother, would of course not invite any such girl as Fleeta. Everything therefore was ended. They would go their different ways. This was the last time they would stand face to face. They looked at each other with the fuller sense of it, and on Owen's part with an expression of dumb trouble. The intensification of his usual appeal to any interlocutor to add the right thing to what he said. To Fleeta at this moment it appeared that the right thing might easily be the wrong. At any rate he only said, "I want you to understand, you know. I want you to understand." What did he want her to understand? He seemed unable to bring it out, and this understanding was moreover exactly what she wished not to arrive at. Bewildered as she was, she had already taken in as much as she should know what to do with. The blood also was rushing into her face. He liked her, it was stupefying, more than he really ought. That was what was the matter with him, and what he desired her to swallow, so that she was suddenly as frightened as some thoughtless girl who finds herself the object of an overture from a married man. "Good-bye, Mr. Garratt, I must get on," she declared with a cheerfulness that she felt to be an unnatural grimace. She broke away from him sharply, smiling, backing across the grass and then turning altogether and moving as fast as she could. "Good-bye, good-bye," she threw off again as she went, wondering if he would overtake her before she reached the gate, conscious with a red disgust that her movement was almost a run, conscious too of just the confused handsome face with which he would look after her. She felt as if she had answered a kindness with a great flouncing snub, but in any case she had got away, though the distance to the gate, her ugly gallop down the broad walk, every graceless jerk of which hurt her, seemed endless. She signed from afar to a cab on the stand in the Kensington Road, and scrambled into it, glad of the encompassment of the four-wheeler that had officiously obeyed her summons, and that, at the end of 20 yards, when she had violently pulled up a glass, permitted her to recognize the fact that she was on the point of bursting into tears. End of Chapter 6.